The dust of the high prairie was a living thing, a fine restless red powder that clung to everything. The worn leather of the saddle, the crisp sagebrush, and the deep, tired lines on Eli Thorne's face. Eli was a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the Arizona mountains, a cowboy who'd seen too much sun and too many hard decisions. He wasn't a rich man, but his dignity was the finest silk, and his 8-year-old daughter Clara was the purest gold in his unforgiving world. She rode beside him now on her small pony, her braids bouncing, her eyes, the color of a summer sky, constantly scanning the land. They were riding along the border of the powerful Barris Ranch, land that everyone in the county knew belonged to the rich, ruthless Sutton family, the kind of people who believed justice was whatever they decided it was. The sun was dropping, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, a beautiful, deadly end to another day. It was Clara, sharp-eyed as a hawk, who spotted it first. "Papa, look. Near the crick, under that cottonwood," she called out, pointing a small, determined finger. "It looks like a bag of old laundry." Eli's hand instinctively went to the familiar, worn grip of his revolver. Nothing was ever just old laundry out here. He taught Clara that the Wild West was a place where you had to pay attention to the smallest details, because sometimes the smallest detail was the difference between life and death. He pulled his mount to a stop, the reins creaking. "Stay put, little bird," he ordered, his voice low and gritty. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and walked toward the small, heavy burlap sack abandoned carelessly near the trickle of water, barely covered by a few broken branches. It looked too neat to be a natural accident. It looked like someone meant for it to disappear. As he got closer, a sound cut through the silence of the twilight, a sound so tiny and fragile it almost didn't register over the buzz of the cicadas, a small, muffled whimper, a cry of deep distress. It wasn't the sound of an animal caught in a trap. It was the sound of human fear. A cold dread, heavier than the sack itself, settled in Eli's stomach. He dropped to one knee, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and reached out a cautious hand. The sack shifted, and the whimpering intensified. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever was inside was alive and in desperate trouble. With a quick, powerful movement, he tore the rough stitching holding the top of the sack closed. What spilled out was not an animal, not trash, but a human being. A young woman, barely more than a girl, thin as a rail, with long, tangled black hair and clothes that were ragged and soiled. Her eyes, wide with terror and shadowed with hunger, flinched from the sudden burst of evening light. She was clearly a soul who had been judged by a cruel, unseen jury, declared worthless, and left to die in the vast, indifferent landscape. The injustice of it hit Eli like a physical blow. To abandon a creature like this, to treat a human life as discardable refuse, it was the mark of a savage, arrogant evil he couldn't abide. Before Eli could even process the shock, Clara was beside him. She hadn't obeyed his order to stay back, but now he was glad she hadn't. Where his reaction was shock and controlled fury, hers was pure, immediate compassion. The girl in the sack was whimpering, shrinking back into the rough cloth, her arms crossed over her thin chest. Clara, without a moment's hesitation, moved forward. She knelt gently, her soft cotton dress brushing the dirt, and she didn't speak. She just reached out a small, sun-browned hand and gently smoothed the hair back from the terrified girl's forehead. It was then, in that moment of silent, profound connection, the pampered daughter of a poor but proud cowboy and the nameless, discarded victim, that the air seemed to crackle. The girl in the sack looked up, truly looked up, and the flickering twilight illuminated her face. Her features were delicate, etched with suffering, but beneath the fear, there was an unmistakable bone structure, a strength in the set of her jaw and her eyes, a deep, luminous hazel, the same color as the river stones polished by time and water. Clara gasped, a sharp, sudden intake of breath that made Eli snap his head toward her. He expected tears or perhaps a fearful retreat. Instead, her eyes were huge, not with fright, but with a dawning recognition that was impossible, yet undeniably real. She looked from the girl in the sack to her father's face, then back again, her lips trembling. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound, yet it cut through the vast silence of the prairie like a ringing bell. "Papa, she's Mama." The world stopped spinning for Eli Thorne. The sound of the wind, the distant lowing of cattle, the thump of his own heart, all went silent. He stared at the girl in the dirt, the girl they had left to die, and then at his daughter. He had told Clara 100 stories about her mother, Anya, a vibrant, courageous immigrant woman he had loved completely, a woman who had been taken from them 8 years ago, just weeks after Clara was born. They told him she had been lost in the brutal winter, swept away by a sudden flood while trying to travel for medical aid. It was a tragedy that had hollowed him out, leaving only the fierce love for his daughter to fill the space. But now, looking at the girl's hazel eyes, the curve of her cheek, a memory flashed. A small, secret silver locket he had given Anya, engraved with a single mountain flower. Driven by a desperate electric hope, Eli reached out and with trembling fingers, found the thin chain around the girl's neck, hidden beneath the folds of her dress. He tugged it gently. The silver locket, tarnished but unmistakable, lay against the rough burlap. The mountain flower gleamed in the last rays of the sun. It was the same locket. It was Anya. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a miracle. It was a brutal, horrifying confirmation. This wasn't a stranger. This was the woman he had mourned for 8 years. She was alive, reduced to a desperate, silent state, dumped like refuse on the edge of the powerful Sutton land. The shock gave way instantly to a cold, focused fury, the kind that sharpens a man's senses and makes his movements precise and deadly. Anya, he breathed, his voice a raw whisper of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. The sound of her name after 8 years of silence seemed to penetrate the haze of her terror. Her wide eyes flickered and a single silent tear tracked a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. She didn't speak, but she didn't flinch when Eli gently scooped her up, the weight of her suffering feather light in his powerful arms. "Clara," he said, his voice flat with resolve. "We're going home. You ride fast. Don't look back." His eyes were hard, fixed on the distant outline of the Barris Ranch buildings. The source of all the power, the cruelty, and now, the profound injustice he was holding in his arms. He carried Anya, still shrouded in the remnants of the burlap, back to his horse. He wasn't thinking about a doctor. He was thinking about a promise, a sacred vow to his wife and his daughter. This was not a rescue. This was a reclamation. This was justice due. The story they had told him, the flood, the loss, was a lie, a cruel and elaborate cover-up. Someone had stolen his wife, held her captive, stripped her of her dignity and life, and then, believing her to be at death's door, had coldly discarded her. The gravity of the situation was immense. He was challenging the most powerful family in the territory. As he rode into the gathering darkness, holding the woman he loved and thought he had lost, with his brave daughter riding point, Eli Thorne felt the pride of his solitary life solidify into a steely, unshakable resolve. He was just a poor cowboy, but his soul was not for sale, and his family was a line no man dared cross. The quiet dignity of his years of honest struggle was now the shield and the weapon he would use to fight the darkness that had consumed his wife. He would not just nurse her back to health. He would move heaven and earth to uncover the truth, to stand up for the dignity that had been violently stolen from her, and to bring down the full measure of hard, uncompromising justice upon those who had abandoned her in the sack to die. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. This was a story of the Wild West, a story of the poor standing up to the powerful, of truth rising from the dust, and of the unbreakable, fierce love of a family that refused to be forgotten or erased. They were coming for what was theirs. The night was vast, but Eli's courage was vaster. The ride back to the small, proud ranch was a silent, agonizing blur of dark earth and starlight. Eli held Anya across his saddle, her feather-light weight a testament to the years of abuse and starvation. She remained silent, conscious, but lost in a place of terror beyond words. Clara rode close, her initial brave shock replaced by a fierce, quiet protectiveness. She didn't ask questions. She simply held the light for her father, her small face set in a grim, adult determination. When they finally reached the cabin, a humble, solid structure Eli had built with his own 2 hands, the moon was high, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to hold all the secrets of the world. Eli gently carried Anya inside and laid her on his own clean, feather-stuffed bed. Clara was already moving, lighting the lanterns, stirring the dying embers in the stove, and fetching the basin of fresh water. They moved as a team, forged by years of necessary independence. Eli cut away the soiled, cheap clothes Anya wore, revealing a landscape of old, fading bruises and, more disturbingly, the evidence of long-term confinement. It wasn't just physical neglect, it was calculated cruelty. He worked with the practiced tenderness of a man who'd nursed sick horses and injured cattle, but this was his wife, the vibrant woman whose laugh had once filled this cabin, now reduced to a fearful, silent wraith. He washed the dirt and dust from her skin, careful with her fragile bones, and wrapped her in his softest wool blanket. He found no major, recent wounds, only the terrible, crushing weight of neglect. The Suttons hadn't killed her outright. They had simply decided to let nature finish the job by leaving her for the buzzards. Clara brought a cup of thin, warm broth, and with incredible patience she knelt by the bed. "Mama," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing, "you need to be strong. Papa and I need you." She offered the spoon, waiting. For a long, fearful moment, Anya didn't move. Then, her luminous hazel eyes, the ones Eli remembered holding the whole Arizona sunset, flickered. She swallowed once, then again, the effort clearly immense. The sight of that tiny act of survival was more powerful than any battle Eli had ever won. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a slow, agonizing rebirth, and it had to be done in absolute secrecy. Eli knew he couldn't take her to a doctor. Any inquiry, any whisper of a mysterious woman showing up from the dead, would bring the Sutton machine down on them instantly. They had already been victims of the Suttons' power once. He wouldn't risk it again. He was going to heal her himself, drawing on the years of self-taught medicine and the sheer force of his love and will. For the next 3 days, the cabin was a fortress of silence and quiet, constant care. Eli sat by the bed, forcing her to drink, keeping her warm, speaking to her in low, steady tones, not of their past, not of his fury, but of the simple good things of the present. The warmth of the fire, the taste of clean water, the safety of the walls. Clara was the miracle. When Eli's strong hands and grim determination couldn't break through Anya's terror, Clara's pure, unwavering love did. She crawled into the big bed, lay beside her mother, and simply held her hand, humming the forgotten lullabies Eli had tried to teach her years ago. It was Clara's presence, the living, breathing evidence of the life Anya had been stolen from, that slowly, haltingly pulled her back. On the 4th day, Anya finally spoke. It wasn't a word, but a choked, tearing sob of realization. She reached out a skeletal hand and touched Clara's face, then Eli's, and the dam of silence broke, letting loose a terrible, shuddering grief that finally allowed hope to enter the room. The truth, when it finally began to trickle out in gasping, fearful whispers, was even worse than Eli had imagined. Mrs. Sutton, the cold, iron-willed matriarch of the Bar-S, had never forgiven Eli for choosing an immigrant woman, Anya, over her own spoiled, eligible daughter years ago. When Anya had set out for town that winter, the Suttons, using their money and influence, had intercepted her. They didn't kill her. They kept her locked away on a distant, isolated property they owned, a ghost ranch, treating her as a servant, a prisoner, and a means of revenge against Eli. They had circulated the story of the flood, paid off the few people who might have questioned it, and wiped Anya's existence from the town's memory. Years of forced isolation and abuse had broken her spirit, but not her will to live. When she finally fell ill and the Suttons decided she was too much trouble, they discarded her, literally throwing her away, believing she was too weak and broken to survive or to ever tell her story. The story finished, Anya collapsed, exhausted, but the fear in her eyes was now mixed with a terrible fire, the fire of dignity rediscovered. Eli looked at her, at his daughter, and at the walls of the small home that had been invaded by this terrible secret. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for his family's safety now. He was fighting for every poor man and woman who had ever been crushed by the casual cruelty of the rich and powerful. This was about justice, not the justice bought in a dusty courthouse, but the hard, elemental justice of the Old West. He strapped on his gun belt, the leather squeaking ominously. He checked his rifle, polished and oiled, loading it carefully. He looked at his wife and daughter. "I'm going to the Bar-S," he said, his voice flat, his face a mask of resolute calm. "I'm not going to fight. Not yet. I'm going to talk to Mr. Sutton and let him know that their dark secret is breathing again." Anya, pale but steadier, reached out and caught his hand. "Eli, no. They will kill you now. They have everything, the law, the men, the money." He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had seen so much darkness. "And I have the truth, Anya. The truth and my pride. They threw a poor girl in a sack to die. They forgot that the cowboy who loved her taught his daughter to recognize her mother's face. That is their mistake. I won't sneak away. I will walk in the front door, with the courage of a man who knows he has nothing left to lose, and everything to gain back." He kissed her forehead and looked at Clara, who had never taken her eyes off him. "You stay here, little bird. Protect your mama. Don't open this door for anyone but me." Eli Thorne mounted his horse and rode toward the Bar-S ranch in broad daylight. He wasn't trying to hide. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the word to travel faster than the wind that the dead man was coming for the living. The Bar-S was a massive, sprawling complex, a symbol of absolute power. Eli tied his horse to the ornate rail, the simple, weathered look of his rig a stark contrast to the mansion's polished wood and brass. He walked up the steps, his boots heavy, making a sound that echoed unnervingly in the silence. He didn't knock. He simply opened the front door and walked in. He found Mr. Sutton in his parlor, sipping whiskey, surrounded by the trappings of his ill-gotten wealth. Sutton was a man who looked like he'd never missed a meal or lost a night's sleep, until he looked up and saw Eli Thorne standing in his entryway, his eyes holding the cold, implacable fury of 8 lost years. Sutton's face went instantly, sickeningly white, the color draining away as if pulled by an invisible tide. He knew. Eli didn't have to say a word. The cowboy's arrival, the simple fact of his presence and the set of his jaw, told the whole damning story. "She's alive, Sutton," Eli said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous calm that was more terrifying than any shout. "And she is home with her daughter. You lied. You stole. You imprisoned. And you tried to murder my wife by leaving her in a sack to die on your property. You underestimated the bond between a mother and a child, and the dignity of a man you thought you could break. This was not a negotiation. This was a statement of war." Eli didn't need to stay. His message was delivered. The fear in Sutton's eyes was the first victory. Eli turned and walked out, leaving the rich man paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying knowledge that his reign of cruel, careless power was about to meet its fierce, righteous end. Eli rode back home, knowing the fight had just begun, but he rode back to a warm fire and the woman who was no longer a ghost, and the daughter who had brought her back. The full weight of the Baras would fall upon them soon, but this time they were standing together, united by courage and the truth. Eli rode back to his small, resolute ranch with a cold certainty settling in his gut, the quiet before the storm was over. He hadn't been home an hour before the first sign of Sutton retaliation appeared. It wasn't a troop of riders or a threat, it was something far more insidious, a deliberate, targeted strike at the very foundation of Eli's life. A rider from the general store in town appeared, looking pale and nervous, holding a sheaf of papers. He delivered the message with hurried apologies. Mr. Sutton had called in all of Eli's outstanding loans, every piece of credit, every debt, small and large, now held by the Baras Bank. Eli had 10 days to pay back the full amount, a sum he knew was impossible to raise or forfeit his land, his cabin, everything. This was the Sutton way, not violence first but financial ruin, a legal, clean way to crush a man's pride and send him away forever. They were trying to take the ground from under his feet so he would be forced to flee before he could tell Anya's full story. Eli crumpled the papers, the dry scratch of the cheap paper a frustrating counterpoint to the thunder of his anger. He walked into the cabin, finding a scene that both calmed and fueled his resolve. Anya, still frail, was sitting up in bed, and Clara was reading aloud from an old, worn Bible, not for the scripture, but for the sound of her own steady, comforting voice. Anya's eyes met his, and she saw the fury and the impossible predicament written plainly on his face. She reached out her hand, not as a victim but as the strong woman he remembered. "They are trying to buy our silence, Eli," she said, her voice still weak but clear, carrying the resonance of a truth she had been denied for too long. "They tried to buy my life 8 years ago too. We will not sell it now." Her courage was the strongest medicine he could ask for. They sat by the fire late into the night, the three of them, a fortress of family against the world, and they made a plan. They didn't have money but they had witnesses. They had the truth, and they had the unbreakable proof of Anya's survival and the location where she was abandoned. The next day Eli rode out again but not to the Suttons. He rode to the few men in the territory he knew still valued a man's word over a powerful man's silver. The old sheriff, Jedediah, a man who had seen too many seasons of injustice but whose soul still held a straight line, and a young, eager lawyer in the neighboring county, a man known for taking on impossible cases for little more than the cost of a good steak and a principal. Sheriff Jedediah was wary. He listened to Eli's tale in the dusty back office of the jailhouse, his face unreadable beneath his sweat-stained hat. He looked at the details of the abandonment, the location on Sutton land, the years of disappearance. "Eli," the sheriff said, his voice low and tired, "you're accusing the most powerful woman in the territory of kidnapping and attempted murder. You'll be standing alone." "No, Sheriff," Eli replied, his voice a gravelly echo of absolute conviction. "I'll be standing with my wife and my daughter. The man who abandoned her in a sack to die thought he was erasing a nobody. He was wrong. He was erasing a mother. That is the truth. And the truth, when it's held by 3 people who aren't afraid to lose everything, is louder than all of Sutton's money." The lawyer, Mr. Finch, was younger, more fiery. When Eli finished his account, the lawyer didn't ask about evidence. He asked about the debt. "They want the land, Mr. Thorne," Finch said, leaning across his cluttered desk. They're trying to make you homeless before we can get you into a courtroom. It's a classic power play. Then we strike first, Eli said simply. We file the charge. We make the claim of kidnapping and attempted murder of Anya Thorne, before the 10 days are up. We make so much noise they can't sneak my land away from me. We force them to answer the charge of their crime, not my debt. It was a reckless, desperate gamble. A poor cowboy challenging a king, using a few honest words as his only shield. But it was the only way to transform the shame of Anya's abandonment into the power of their united stand. Back at the cabin, Clara was their silent sentinel. She guarded the door, she nursed her mother with fierce attention, and she helped Eli polish the old silver locket, the piece of evidence they would present. It wasn't just a trinket, it was the symbol of the life the Suttons had tried to erase. The small mountain flower engraving gleamed, proof that the woman they abandoned was not a nameless pauper, but a wife, a mother, and a person of inherent dignity. As the end of the 10-day debt period approached, the atmosphere in the county thickened into a heavy, oppressive silence. Everyone knew the cowboy was challenging the Barras. Bets were being laid, not on who would win but on how quickly Eli Thorne would be destroyed. But no one had seen Anya. The Suttons, growing dangerously impatient, sent a rider to the small cabin with a final chilling offer. Sign the papers surrendering the land, take a small sum of hush money, and leave the territory forever. Eli met the rider at his fence line. Tell Mr. Sutton this, Eli said, his voice steady, his eyes the color of a winter sky. My wife is ready to stand with me in court and testify to every cruel hour she spent in his family's bondage. She is ready to point out the spot where they left her for the crows. Tell him the cowboy's daughter recognized her mother, and the mother is finally ready to speak. The only papers I will sign are the ones swearing to the truth of the charges against his family. The rider galloped away, carrying not just a rejection, but a declaration of war built on unshakable familial courage. Eli watched him go, then turned to face the cabin. He had played his final, desperate hand. The 10 days were up. Now they would see if the promise of American justice, the idea that even the poor deserve protection, was stronger than the crushing, arrogant power of the rich. The door of the Barras courtroom was about to open, and the true, painful story of the abandoned girl was finally going to be told. The courthouse in the county seat was a solid, brick monument, designed to project authority and fairness, but the air inside was thick with tension, prejudice, and the scent of expensive cigars. On one side of the room sat Mr. Sutton and the cold, unyielding Mrs. Sutton, surrounded by a phalanx of expensive, sharply dressed lawyers, a visual representation of their overwhelming power. On the other side, huddled together for strength, were Eli Thorne, his wife Anya, and their daughter Clara, accompanied only by the young, earnest lawyer, Mr. Finch. Anya sat upright, wrapped in a simple, dark shawl, still thin, but no longer the silent wraith of the sack. Her face was calm, her hazel eyes fixed forward, radiating a quiet, terrifying strength. The Suttons' lawyers had already tried every trick to block the case, claiming Anya was an imposter, claiming Eli was attempting fraud to erase his debts, and finally claiming Anya was mentally unstable due to her fictional years of wandering. All these attempts had been deflected by Mr. Finch's relentless focus on one simple fact: an undeniable case of abandonment on Sutton property, and the immediate, emotional testimony of an 8-year-old child. The courtroom was packed, the local community hungry for the spectacle. Everyone knew the story, the dead woman, the cowboy's defiance, and the 10-day debt countdown that had brought them to this precipice. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a referendum on who truly ruled the territory, the rule of law or the rule of money. The climax of the day arrived when Anya was called to the stand. Walking past the Sutton table, she held her head high, the small silver locket, now cleaned and gleaming, resting against the dark fabric of her dress. As she was sworn in, a deep hush fell over the room. Mr. Finch began gently, asking her to recount the day she was lost 8 years ago. Her voice, still weak from her long ordeal, carried every word with a shocking clarity that silenced the sneering lawyers and the skeptical townspeople. She described the ambush not by bandits or a flood, but by Mrs. Sutton's hired hands. She described the isolated ghost ranch where she was held, stripped of her identity, and forced into brutal servitude, not for ransom but for spite, to punish Eli for choosing her. And then she reached the day of her abandonment. I was too weak to work, Anya testified, her hands resting quietly in her lap. They said I was no longer useful. They put me in a sack, a feed sack, like they were discarding spoiled grain. Her gaze lifted then, passing over the judge and settling directly, intensely on Mrs. Sutton. They drove for hours and then they dumped me by the creek on the edge of their land, where they knew no one would find me. They left me to die of thirst and exposure. But they did not know the strength of a mother's will to see her child again. At this point, the Suttons' lead counsel stood up, his face flushed, shouting objections, calling it theater and fabrication. But the damage was done. The sheer, quiet power of Anya's truth had pierced the thick armor of the Suttons' reputation. Mr. Finch then called his final, most crucial witness, Clara Thorne. The girl, wearing her best Sunday dress and holding her father's hand until she reached the stand, seemed impossibly small against the grandeur of the courtroom. The judge, seeing her size, spoke kindly, asking her to tell the court what she saw that evening by the creek. Clara didn't hesitate. She looked directly at the judge, her eyes shining with the unvarnished honesty of a child who knew the difference between right and wrong. "I saw a bag of laundry, Your Honor. But it was crying. And when Papa opened it, I saw her face." She paused, then pointed a small, steady finger at the silver locket around her mother's neck. "Papa told me my mama was lost to the flood. But when I saw the lady in the sack, I knew her. And I saw the little flower Papa told me about. And I whispered to Papa, 'She's Mama.' A sack cannot stop love, Your Honor. It was my mama and they tried to throw her away." The testimony of the child, so simple, so pure, was the final devastating blow. It bypassed all the legal maneuvering and struck at the heart of the community's conscience. The image of the powerful Suttons reducing a human being to a piece of refuse, only to be recognized by the pure love of a daughter, was a moral indictment that no amount of money could silence. The judge, a man who had seen all the lies and truths the West could offer, finally pounded his gavel. He didn't issue a final verdict on the criminal charges immediately, but he issued a powerful, immediate injunction against the Suttons. He declared that due to the grave and credible testimony regarding kidnapping and attempted murder, any action taken against Eli Thorne's land and property was immediately suspended until the criminal investigation was complete. The attempt to financially ruin the Thornes had failed. The legal wall of gold that surrounded the Suttons was cracked. As the family walked out of the courthouse, the crowd parted. The people didn't cheer, but they looked at Eli and Anya with a new respect. The profound reverence one gives to those who have fought against overwhelming darkness and lived. The Suttons remained seated, their faces masks of cold, defeated rage. Outside, in the bright, dusty sun, Eli pulled Anya and Clara close. He looked at his wife, who was finally home, no longer a ghost, but a beacon of dignity recovered through her own fierce courage. "We got the chance, Anya," Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We got the chance to fight them with the truth." Anya leaned into her husband and daughter, the three of them standing together against the vast, unforgiving sky. The criminal fight was not over, but the moral victory had been won. The abandoned girl was home, and the cowboy's daughter had not only saved her mother but had reminded the entire county that true justice and dignity belonged to all, not just the wealthy. The simple, honest love of a family had proven to be the most powerful weapon in the Wild West. The injunction against the Suttons, freezing their claim on Eli's land, was more than a legal maneuver. It was a defiant shot fired across the territory's bow. For the first time in memory, the mighty Barras hadn't gotten its way. But the victory felt fragile, like thin ice over deep water. Eli knew the Suttons wouldn't simply accept the temporary defeat. Their kind of power wasn't relinquished. It was seized back with brutal force, cloaked in whatever legal or extra-legal means necessary. The most immediate change was in the town itself. People who had once looked through Eli now met his gaze with a complex mix of fear and admiration. Small acts of rebellion began to surface. The grocer, who had cut off Eli's credit on Sutton's orders, now slipped Clara an extra pound of sugar, whispering, "Tell your mama that was a long time coming, child." A neighboring rancher, a quiet man who had always kept his distance, rode over and offered Eli a day's labor, refusing payment, stating only, "The land shouldn't belong to those who would throw a human away." These gestures, small but meaningful, showed that the truth of Anya's suffering, voiced so bravely in court, had finally begun to pierce the thick hide of community fear. Back at the cabin, Anya was recovering physically with astonishing speed, fueled by good food, the pure mountain air, and the sheer power of being loved. But her greatest transformation was internal. The terror that had kept her silent and submissive for 8 years was replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She would sit by the window, not staring out in fear but watching the horizon, planning. She was determined that her stolen years would not be in vain. She would not just be a victim but the instrument of justice. "They never saw me as a person, Eli," she said one evening looking at the fire. "I was a thing, a tool for their spite. They thought by reducing me to a sack of refuse, they could erase the pride we share. But it was their act of abandonment that became the proof of their crime. We must not just win the land, we must ensure they never treat another soul that way again. Eli knew the lawyers would continue the slow, grinding legal fight, but he also knew where the real battle lay, with Mrs. Sutton. She was the architect of the cruelty, the one who carried the coldest, most personal spite. As long as she felt immune, the danger would remain. A week after the injunction, Eli made a calculated, dangerous decision. He left Anya and Clara in the care of the trusted neighboring rancher, giving him the rifle and the solemn instruction to shoot first and ask questions later if anyone approached the cabin. Then Eli rode back to the bars. This time he wasn't going to talk to Mr. Sutton. He was going for the root of the evil. He didn't ride to the mansion. He rode to the isolated, forgotten ghost ranch, the very prison where Anya had been held for 8 years. He arrived at dusk, tying his horse out of sight, and walked the grounds. The place was desolate, silent, a decaying monument to Mrs. Sutton's malice. He found what he was looking for in the broken-down barn, a set of rusting shackles and a small, forgotten notebook tucked into a wall crevice, filled with Anya's tiny, cramped handwriting. She had kept a secret log of every cruel day, every forced labor, and the names of the hands who had delivered her to the creek, irrefutable proof of her captivity and the conspiracy. As he was leaving the ghost ranch, a carriage approached, pulled by 2 black horses, driven by the bar's foreman. And in the back sat Mrs. Sutton, draped in black lace, her face a pale mask of fury. She had come to destroy any evidence that might linger, but she was too late. Eli stepped into the road, blocking her path, the notebook clutched in his hand. "You cannot be here, Thorne," she hissed, her voice cutting and sharp. "You are trespassing. I will have you hanged." Eli didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, chilling finality of a judge. "I am here, ma'am, where you kept my wife prisoner for 8 years. You tried to ruin me, but you only reminded me what I was fighting for. You took away her freedom, her strength, and her dignity, then tried to kill her. You thought you could throw a poor girl away in a sack, believing no one would care." He held up the locket and the small, defiant notebook. "You thought your money was your shield. But it's not. My daughter recognized the face you tried to hide. My wife wrote down every crime you committed against her. And now, the community has seen the courage of a family that has nothing but the truth." He didn't need to threaten her. He simply showed her the irrefutable evidence she had failed to destroy. The pride in her eyes flickered into cold terror as she realized the depth of her miscalculation. She hadn't left a victim, she had left a witness who knew everything. "I will see you and your thing of a wife rot," she spat, her voice laced with venom. Eli looked at her, then turned and walked away, not engaging in her petty rage. He had what he needed. He had the proof to win the criminal case, to ensure not just that his land was safe, but that the architects of Anya's suffering would finally face true justice. As he rode away, leaving Mrs. Sutton stranded in the deepening twilight, Eli felt a peace he hadn't known in 8 years. The victory wouldn't be won with bullets or bravado, but with the quiet dignity of a mother's testimony and the unbreakable love of a family. The sack had been abandoned, but the girl inside was now standing tall, ready to reclaim her life and ensure that in the wild, sprawling West, a name and a person's worth could not be bought or thrown away. The final showdown was not in the courthouse, but in the slow, relentless mechanism of the law that Eli and Mr. Finch had set into motion. With the evidence gathered from the ghost ranch, Anya's defiant journal and the names of the hired hands, the case shifted decisively. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable truth, the Suttons' arrogance began to crumble. The local community, seeing the tide turn, was now openly supportive of the Thornes, emboldened by the family's simple, unshakable courage. No longer could the Suttons rely on the silent complicity that had fueled their power. The truth did not just hurt the Suttons, it began to destroy them. The criminal investigation opened up deeper inquiries into their long history of land grabbing and intimidation. The Great Bar S was no longer a symbol of untouchable wealth, but a monument to cruelty and deceit. The legal resolution arrived not with a dramatic courtroom speech, but with a quiet, bitter necessity, a settlement. The Suttons, terrified of a public trial that would reveal every ugly secret of their matriarch's vindictiveness, conceded. They dropped all claims on Eli's land, paid a substantial sum to the Thorne family in damages, a small recompense for 8 stolen years, and most importantly Mrs. Sutton was forced to issue a written, albeit heavily managed, statement acknowledging the grievous error concerning Anya's disappearance and subsequent abandonment. It wasn't the justice of a jail cell, but it was the profound dignity of a public confession from a family that believed itself above reproach. The day the papers were signed, Eli rode into town not to fight, but to file the final documents that secured his land and his future. He didn't celebrate. He felt only the quiet, heavy relief of a war finally won. He carried the damaged money back to his ranch, but it was not the money that defined the victory. It was the fact that Anya was standing on the porch waiting for him, bathed in the afternoon light, looking like the strong, beautiful woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. The Thorns were no longer the poor, isolated family at the edge of the territory. They were a legend. Their story, of the abandoned woman, the loyal cowboy, and the daughter who knew her mother by heart, became a powerful living piece of USA storytelling, told around campfires and in general stores. It was a story about the vital importance of the individual's dignity against the crushing weight of power, and of how deep, honest love can defeat even the most elaborate lie. With the settlement money, Eli and Anya didn't buy a bigger house or ostentatious goods. They paid off their debts, improved their modest ranch, and most tellingly, established a small, private fund managed by Mr. Finch to help other small ranchers in the county who faced illegal pressure or financial ruin from the powerful elite. Their victory was not just for themselves. It was a stake driven into the ground for the entire community, ensuring that justice, though slow, would be a tool available to the poor as well as the rich. Clara, the hero of the discovery, grew up knowing the profound truth of her own power. She knew that simply speaking the truth with an honest heart could move mountains and bring justice where none seemed possible. Her whispered, "Papa, she's Mama," was the whisper that brought down a powerful empire of lies. Years later, the Bar S, stripped of its cruel prestige and its architects marginalized, began to fade, a stark example of what happens when power abandons humanity. The Thorn Ranch, however, flourished, not the biggest but the most respected. Eli and Anya worked the land side by side, their bond forged anew in the fire of their shared battle. They never forgot the terror of the sack, but they transformed that image into one of enduring hope. The poor girl who was left to die had not only lived but had forced the entire territory to reckon with its conscience. Her story became the silent vow of the West, that every life holds value and that no human being, rich or poor, can ever be simply thrown away. The Thorn family proved that the greatest wealth is not in land or silver, but in the fierce, unyielding courage to demand dignity and the strength of the love that binds a family together. And in the vast, open spaces of the Wild West, that was the most enduring victory of all. The Arizona sun, which had once felt so harsh and unforgiving, now shone on the Thorn Ranch with the warmth of vindication. The legal battle was a closed book, the Suttons defeated not by force, but by the undeniable strength of a mother's will and a daughter's love. Yet, the true ending to their story was not found in court documents or settlement money. It was woven into the quiet, everyday fabric of their reclaimed lives. The small, simple cabin, once a place of mourning and then a fortress of secrecy, became a home brimming with the deep, settled peace that only hard-won dignity can provide. Eli and Anya, though bearing the scars of their ordeal, shared a bond that had been tempered and strengthened in the fire of injustice. Anya no longer slept with a flicker of terror in her eyes. She slept holding Eli's hand, finally safe. She poured her energy not into vengeance, but into the land, planting a small, vibrant garden by the creek where she had been abandoned, a symbolic act of life triumphing over death. The mountain flower from her locket was the first thing she planted, a permanent reminder that even where cruelty had sown despair, courage could harvest beauty. Clara, the quiet hero, never forgot the sight of the sack, but she learned to see it not as a source of trauma, but as the origin of their greatest victory. She grew into a young woman with a spine of steel and a heart full of compassion, possessing the unshakable moral certainty that had saved her mother. She understood, better than anyone, that her family's story was a potent weapon against the forces of arrogance and oppression. She would often share their tale, teaching that the highest form of pride was not in wealth or power, but in standing for what is right, even when alone. The fund they established quietly changed the balance of power in the county. It became known as the Reckoning, a source of legal aid for the poor, a signal that the days of casual tyranny were over. Eli, once just a cowboy, became a respected elder statesman. His counsel sought not for his knowledge of cattle, but for his profound understanding of human nature and justice. The fate of the Suttons was a lesson for the whole territory. Stripped of their ability to manipulate the law and the community's fear, their vast estate began to wither, haunted by the shadow of their crimes. They learned that in the long run, decency and courage are more enduring currencies than gold. The Thorn family stood as a living testament to the powerful, often unseen strength of ordinary American lives. Their story, begun with a brutal act of discrimination and abandonment, ended with a legacy of unbreakable love. The girl they had left in a sack to die was the woman who reminded the Wild West that every soul is sacred, and that the call of family is a bond stronger than any chain. Their life wasn't just a survival story, it was a profound, enduring victory for the very heart of human dignity. And so, under the vast, honest sky of the West, the cowboy, the mother, and the daughter who knew her finally lived in the peace they had earned, their history etched forever as a powerful ballad of justice achieved.